Hello, honeys. This is Celia speaking. Welcome back to Highbrow Honey. I'm going to apologize right off the bat for any background noise that you may hear throughout this episode. I don't know why, but the maintenance workers in my complex have decided to start sawing through some of the metal support poles in various buildings here. So anyways, that's what's happening for some reason. This episode has been a long time coming, and we are finally talking about Hatshepsut and masculinized images. So the gist of our focus today is going to be, of course, on the images of Hatshepsut and how she is physically as well as culturally masculinized in them in order to demonstrate how power structures and gender in ancient Egypt, especially in the ruling systems, worked. We're also going to look closely at the differences in interpretations as they relate to women's stories between how the old class of art/art historians interpreted not only her images, but the story of her legacy, and how the newer classes interpret her story and the story of her artwork. As always, if you feel inclined to do any research yourself or are just also similarly academically scarred, we do have that source document listing all of our references available in the episode description for your use. What's amazing about this story is that we can get at those two questions, the images themselves as well as the interpretations later of them, by essentially just going through Hatshepsut's biography. So let's start there. She was likely born in 1504 BCE and was the elder of two daughters born to a mom named Amos and the dad, King Thutmose I, who was a charismatic leader of legendary military exploits. Around the age of 12, she married her half-brother Thutmose II, likely to reinforce his claim to royalty because he was the son of a secondary wife by the name of Montnofrit. At this time, she gains a super high status, according to world history, by being appointed the title of God's wife of Amun. They say, quote, by the time of the New Kingdom, a woman holding the title of God's wife of Amun was powerful enough to dictate policy, though not as powerful as she would become later in the Third Intermediate Period, end quote. What made this role so special is that she engaged with the divine forces through her responsibilities of singing and dancing for the god Amun at the beginning of festivals to quote-unquote arouse him for the creative act, and this obviously lent her a ton of elevated status. The other details of the role are unclear, but it's recorded to be a powerful office. Only a couple of years into their marriage, so estimates put that at about 1479 BCE, she becomes queen regent when Thutmose III inherited the throne after his father's death. Now, Thut II's only child with Hatshepsut was a daughter by the name of Neferure, and Thut III being an infant, Hatshepsut becomes the regent for her stepson. As per tradition, she handles the affairs of state until he becomes old enough to rule. Neferure had, of course, been disqualified from pharaohhood on the basis of sex. Now, statues and monuments from this time of her and the two Thutmoses show her in a supporting role, often standing behind her husband or behind Thut III in order to show a sort of hierarchical relationship between all three. Historians of both the old and new classes, however, note that she was comparatively more ambitious and, through her adoption of certain traditions, even kingly. Some argue that she was even treated as more of the king than her stepson during their co-rule. Of course, This leads us directly into the most groundbreaking part. Hatshepsut's taking on a full pharaohhood. She becomes, of course, this co-ruler with Thut III, as we talked about, around 1473 BCE, and thus is the sixth of the 18th dynasty of pharaohs. In the words of the Brooklyn Museum, quote, Hatshepsut actively asserted her role as pharaoh and sought to legitimize her rule over Egypt in numerous, highly visible ways, end quote. We're going to come back to this, but there are several reasons for her making these sorts of moves. So for now, it's important to know that the two top reasons proposed are, one, a political crisis caused her to take the throne in order to protect it for her stepson, maybe from other branches of the royal family, and two, could have just been personal ambition. Important note, however, because kingship was associated with godhood, once she was a pharaoh or co-ruler, co-king, she could not step down. It simply was illogical, impossible. The next obvious question is, what was she like then as a pharaoh? Here's where we get into all the fun art stuff, so let's take a close look at her rule. Hatshepsut is a standout character, so to speak, because she's only the fourth woman to become a pharaoh and the first to assume the full powers of that position. She ruled a full 14 centuries before Cleopatra did. And the women who reigned before her were, first, Merneptah, who ruled circa 3000 BC in the early dynastic period, probably as a regent, Sobeknefru, who ruled circa 1807 to 1802 BCE in the Middle Kingdom for sure, and Tuoshret, who ruled circa 1191 to 1190 BCE, definitely towards the end of the 19th dynasty. And here's where we get to circle back to that point that because her rule was so often contested, she had to take many steps to legitimize herself as a king. Many of these steps were savvy political moves. Early in her reign, she marries her daughter to Thutmose III and bestows upon Neferure the position she once herself held of God's wife of Amun in order to secure a strong position on all sides of the throne. Hatshepsut also repeatedly pointed to her own royal lineage and claimed to be her father's chosen successor, even depicting these claims in art. Contemporary scholars believe that this claim of successorship is probably not real, especially because past female pharaohs were only crowned when no male successor existed, but it brought home other points that she was making along the same lines. For example, reburying her father in her own tomb complex in another attempt to legitimize her rule. And here's where we begin to touch on her masculinization in artworks. It's also related to this attempt to justify herself. So a sort of part one, as the Brooklyn Museum describes it, incorporates, quote, a famous series of reliefs at her temple at Deir el-Barahi in the Valley of Kings, which depicts Hatshepsut's divine birth and coronation. In such divine birth scenes, a god, in Hatshepsut's relief it is the chief god Amun, impregnates the pharaoh's mother, thus establishing the pharaoh's rule as a rightful and God-granted part of the divine order of the world. In representing herself as a divine daughter of the gods, she sought to erase any doubts about the legitimacy of her rule as pharaoh, end quote. So Hatshepsut was literally using art to rewrite the political as well as spiritual histories of her family as well as herself and her royal lineage. And that's a very fascinating example of early propaganda. Of course, part two here is that she depicted herself as male or masculine in almost all artworks of her, royal depictions produced throughout her reign. For the most part, she was ordered that she be given the traditional beard afforded other pharaohs in busts and similar statues, as well as more masculinized musculature, the traditional male flail and crook, as well as male royal dress. An interesting internal contradiction, however, is that many statue inscriptions still indicate Hatshepsut's gender through anatomy or else nominal references. For example, daughter of Re, His Majesty herself. Other political moves worth mentioning include that she made lots of important allies out of key government officials, such as Senenmut, the chief minister. Hatshepsut also made untrue or at least exaggerated claims about her role in driving specific enemies out of their lands. She claimed that she'd been involved, for example, in the expulsion of an early Semitic people established at Avaris in Lower Egypt, who had gradually assumed power over the region. The truth, however, is that they had been driven from Egypt by Ahmose of Thebes sometime between 1570 and 1544 BCE, thus marking the start of the New Kingdom many years, many years before she was born. Perhaps knowing that she wouldn't be believed about any direct involvement, she also emphasized being a descendant of this hero, Ahmose of Thebes. Hatshepsut also demonstrated a strong mind for economics. She greatly expanded Egyptian trade, bringing in luxuries like ivory, ebony, gold, leopard skins, and incense from possibly modern-day Eritrea. These were goods that very few people had ever even seen before. She created an extraordinary commercial focus across the Mediterranean, which was also a bit of a two-birds situation for her and a possible survival technique of her stepson. Sending Thut III off to lead some of these armies in order to make these economic expansions possible kept both the armies busy enough to prevent him from being able to switch them all to Thut III's side while improving his own reputation, but it also allowed Thut III to live by proving his value to Hatshepsut. A bit more importantly, and a way for us to circle back to her involvement in arts and architecture, she legitimized herself through spiritual and cultural affirmations as well. One such method was renaming herself. As the Smithsonian says, she, quote, took a new name, Matkare, sometimes translated as truth, Mat, is the soul, Ka, of the sun god, Re, end quote. The most important word of this name, of course, is Mat, truth, the ancient Egyptian concept for godly established order and justice. Only pharaohs were believed to be able to speak with the gods, so they maintained and perpetuated Mat themselves. As the Smithsonian says, quote, by calling herself Matkare, Hatshepsut was likely reassuring her people that they had a legitimate ruler on the throne, end quote. One way for pharaohs to prove or manage their Mat was through grand projects, which is fitting as the Grand Commissioner would be a good title for her. Hatshepsut was a huge patron of the arts. Two of our source authors, Breer and Hobbs, note how, quote, the art produced under her authority was soft and delicate, and she constructed one of the most elegant temples in Egypt against the cliffs outside the Valley of the Kings, end quote. She also erected 200-foot-tall obelisks at the Great Temple Complex at Karnak. Though her smaller art projects are expansive, she's mostly known for overseeing ambitious building projects. World History says, quote, Hatshepsut's greatest efforts went into these building projects, which not only elevated her name and honored the gods, but employed the people. The scope and size of Hatshepsut's constructions, as well as their elegant beauty, attest to a very prosperous reign, end quote. They go on to state that Hatshepsut built on a grander scale than any pharaoh who came either before or after her, with the sole exception of Ramses II, who ruled 1279 through 1213 BCE. So vast and thorough were her building projects, they say, that, quote, there are few museums featuring ancient Egyptian art and artifacts in the present day which do not have some piece commissioned by Pharaoh Hatshepsut, end quote. Perhaps the most impressive of all of her architectural commissions is her futural burial site, the Temple of Deir el-Bahari, located in western Thebes. Despite the enormous scale of this complex, it's roughly the length of 2.5 football fields, its overall impression still manages to be one of airiness, of gracefulness. It's not as fortress-like, stoic, solid as the temples of her predecessors. Instead, this one emphasizes light. This temple's lower levels include ponds, gardens with fragrant trees, and supersized images of Hatshepsut everywhere, including 100 colossal statues of her, a sphinx that guards the processional paths, various devotionals that line the terraces and include images of the female pharaoh up to 10 feet tall. There's even images of gods interacting with her in these inscriptions, or reliefs, I should say. But again, most of these surviving images and statues are huge, masculinized images of Hatshepsut. That, plus the fact that most of these series of reliefs mark the achievements of her reign, again, show us just how much she had to prove herself in everything that she did as a pharaoh. The network of processional as well as standardized roadways and sanctuaries that she built throughout the city of Thebes is similarly lined with reliefs and also speaks to this desire to be considered equal. Of course, as all humans do, she eventually passes. But what's interesting here is the diffs after she died and her legacy ever since. Her year of death is estimated to be 1458 BCE, which puts her in about her mid-40s. An early 2000s examination of her body showed that she died from an abscess developed after a tooth removal. She was buried, of course, in the Valley of Kings, in her temple that's also home to Tutankhamun's. But an important thing to note here is that this was not the Valley of Kings before Hatshepsut. All of those who followed admired her specific burial site, her temple, so much that they went there too and copied it. So, Valley of Kings, started by a queen. Thut III went on to rule for about 30 more years, proving to be both an ambitious builder like his stepmother and a great warrior like his grandfather. History.com explains that after launching a search in 2005, a team of archaeologists discovered her mummy in 2007, and it is now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. What is the tragic loss for art history of this, though, is that a lot of the art she commissioned was destroyed. Various sources differ on how much of this destruction was due to Thut III and how much was due to religious upheaval, tomb robbers, natural collapses, aka other factors. After Hatshepsut's death, Thut III, as a solo ruler, emphasized his direct parental relationship to Thut II while minimizing evidence of Hatshepsut's dominance during their co-regent years. This was almost definitely politically motivated because it allowed him to appoint his own son as a legitimate co-regent near the end of his own reign. Importantly, however, this erasure of the evidence of Hatshepsut's rule occurred very late in Thut III's reign, and mostly focused on images of her as a king on the temples and monuments that she had built. This was possibly done to erase her example as a powerful female ruler or to close the gap in the dynasty's line of male pharaohs. And it's probably more so the latter because it was done after Thutmose III's coronation. This obliteration of records of Hatshepsut was pretty thorough. The Smithsonian details the findings of the 1927 MoMA archaeological team that first came across Deir el-Bahari. They said a large section had been destroyed, quoting that the eyes had been gouged out, heads lopped off, the cobra-like symbol of royalty hacked from the foreheads, end quote. They also found a pit filled with smashed statues of a pharaoh, pieces of which varied in size from that of a fingertip to others weighing a ton or more. Then, in 1903, during a trip to the Valley of the Kings, a British archaeologist by the name of Howard Carter discovered one of 3 sarcophagi she had prepared. Of course, due to this lack of evidence, even scholars of ancient Egypt didn't know about her for a long time. World history says, quote, her existence only came to light fairly recently in history when the Orientalist Jean-Francois Champollion, who lived about 1790 to 1832 CE, and who was most famous for deciphering the Rosetta Stone, found he could not reconcile hieroglyphics indicating a female ruler with statuary obviously depicting a male. These hieroglyphics were found in the inner chambers of Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari. All public recognition of her had been erased, end quote. With all of this destruction, we're really lucky we found any evidence of her at all, much less her mummy. This almost total erasure, of course, is something of a diss after her death. However, how her legacy has been viewed and interpreted by older and newer classes of historians, art historians, speaks a lot to post-mortem disses of important, powerful women throughout history as well. And again here, the thing to pay attention to is these shifts in opinion based on exactly who is examining the art in question. In the older classes, so to speak, ridicule and disdain dominated interpretations as well as rhetoric surrounding Hatshepsut and her rule. Quote, in the words of Metropolitan employee William C. Hayes, she was, quote, the vilest type of usurper, end all quotes. They summarize opinions by saying that scholars were uncomfortable with her continued representation of herself as masculine, with the muscles, with the traditional pharaoh's false beard, with indications that she was so powerful. The Smithsonian says that these such features were, quote, variously interpreted by those historians as an act of outrageous deception, deviant behavior, or both. Many early Egyptologists also concluded that Hatshepsut's chief minister, Senenmut, must have been her lover as well, a co-conspirator in her climb to power, the so-called evil genius behind what they viewed as her devious politics, end quote. A lot of these Egyptologists seriously just saw her as a power-hungry, vain, no morals woman who slept her way to the top. These early scholars often took it a step further, even saying that Senenmut was the real force behind Hatshepsut's rule, saying, quote, "Not even a woman of the most virile character could have attained such a pinnacle of success without masculine support, even as early as 1961. Of course, all of this demeaning language and, sexism, assigning of her power to the men in her life, it's all very outdated, misogynistic, probably untrue, and frankly boring. The newer classes of art historians, thankfully, are much more equal-minded and open-minded. Current curators, for example, Renee Dreyfuss, who's the curator of ancient art and interpretation at the Fine Arts Museum of San Fran, basically just admit this is old sexist nonsense. The Senenmut part especially now has largely been discounted by experts as a extreme, terrible underestimation of Hatshepsut. Furthermore, as I alluded to before, recent scholarship suggests that it was a political crisis, such as a threat from a competing branch of the royal family to the throne that forced Hatshepsut to become a pharaoh. Catherine Roehrig, curator of Egyptian art at the Met in New York City, says that it wasn't a case of stealing the throne so much as, quote, "Hatshepsut may have had to declare herself king to protect the kingship for her stepson," end quote. This interpretation is supported by lots of evidence, including the lack of house arrest or other restrictions on her stepson, Thut III. Furthermore, because Egyptians believed erasing one's name from history ruined one's afterlife, basically erased them from the afterlife, it's possible that whoever was responsible for removing her name from the public areas of society didn't really wish her ill after death, and that's why there are instances of her name preserved in much more secluded areas, for example, of her temple. Debate still rages, however, about why exactly these visual records were destroyed after her death. The Smithsonian Magazine article cites an Egyptologist who was president of the American University of Beirut by the name of Peter Dorman, who says, quote, "I think that people recognize now, because it happened so late in Thutmose III's reign, that it wasn't personal animosity. For some reason, Thutmose III must have decided it was necessary to essentially rewrite the official record of Hatshepsut's kingship," end quote, which meant eradicating all traces of it to suggest that the throne passed directly from his father to himself. Dorman also says that it could have been done to erase this quote-unquote dangerous precedent of a female pharaoh as a means of keeping social order. The article additionally cites Kathleen Keller, a professor of Near Eastern Studies at the University of California at Berkeley until her death last year. Quote, "She was not pretending to be a man. She was not cross-dressing," end quote. Instead, Keller says inscriptions on Hatshepsut's statues almost always contain some indication of her true gender, as we pointed out. So we've come full circle here, because Keller once again says, by calling herself Medkare, Hatshepsut was likely reassuring her people that they had a legitimate ruler on the throne. All right, honeys, that's all I've got for you on this subject at this time. I hope you have all enjoyed learning a little bit about Egyptian and North African, really, art history. Hope you all have had a good week thus far, and I'll catch you all tomorrow for a new episode of The Business, and Thursday for the next installment in our current series, Art That Pisses People Off. Take care. This podcast was created, produced, written, hosted, edited, and fact-checked by Master's graduate Celia Bugno. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on all of your favorite streaming platforms as well as your social medias.